All right, I get the opportunity to welcome all of you all. We have a new setup this morning, as you can see. We're going to start offering the microphone here for when we open it up for questions. So you can come forward and ask your question here, but we do ask that you speak directly into the microphone as a means of accessibility for all of us, including our folks who are joining us online. So it's really important that you speak into the microphone and not just simply project, because also projecting is not COVID safe. So here we go. This morning I get to introduce my colleague, Dorothea. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist and pastoral counselor at TACC. She works with individuals, couples, groups, and families, and specializes in spiritually integrated psychotherapy, mindfulness and body movement through yoga, trauma, grief, life transition, and personal growth. And she comes with a lot of experience and wisdom, both as a counselor and also as a minister. So welcome, Dorothea.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Dr. Lisa Boswell. She's a longtime member here at St. Luke's, an EFM mentor, and a member of the psychiatric community in Atlanta. She received her medical degree from the University of Virginia School of Medicine and has been in practice for more than 20 years. She generously offers her wisdom to many of us throughout her relationships here. So I really, really appreciate you being here as well.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Thank you. All right. Wendy.
We're so fortunate today to have a conversation, to have these amazing members of our community here. I just get to sit here and enjoy this. The reason we're having this conversation is sometimes in church you just need to do the most obvious thing. And the obvious thing is that we are a community that has been through a rough couple of years, surrounded by people that have been through a rough couple of years, our entire nation. In all kinds of different ways, frankly, right? In our isolation, in our inability to be isolated, how this has impacted our families, people we love, the political upheaval of the time as people fight for their rights and visibility, and there's been a very strong reaction to that. And that is reflected within most of our families and households, right? All those positions. And we're seeing this in our community, and we're seeing this all over the church, I think. One of my colleagues calls it COVID neglect. It's what he means is those of us that haven't paid attention to certain things in our health or our mental health because of COVID, right? So that kind of nagging feeling many of us have is that would this have happened if the last couple of years had been different when certain physical elements hit us or crisis or things like that. So most of us are living in this jumble of emotions, which life is anyway, but it's, I think, just a different level. So what we want to do in the next year, at least, if not longer, is work towards being a trauma-informed community, thinking about resiliency, as long as that's the right word, whatever the right word is into the future, where we are in touch with where we are hurt, and we are able to be articulate, or at least aware of that, so that we're not hurting others, right? And that we can reach out in true compassion to the communities around us. So that's the big goal. And most of us know how to suck it up and act like that's the case. But trauma-informed care actually says there's a little bit more to it. And so I don't know about that, but other people do, and we're going to hear about it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And then I have a couple of questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the floor. And I think one of the key pieces is, as we go forward, if we could define our terms. Yeah. If you could all just assume I know nothing, sure. And that would be a huge help to me. So let me just start with, and if my question is wrong, please answer the question that I should have asked, right, to start with. But let's start with something like what is trauma, and why are we talking about that now? It's everywhere in my world.
Yeah, it is.
So I'll start with Lisa.
Sure, we can, and thank you all. Thank you all for being here. It just feels so wonderful to be in community and talking about, in some ways, what we've all been through, what we're going through, how we go forward. how the church meets these times in this moment. Trauma is a way of thinking about any unexpected event, stress. It can be an acute event, or it can be a chronic event, a series of chronic events that essentially overwhelms our ability to cope. So I think it's important to say trauma is different from stress. And I think about it as, we have stress, our stress of daily life. We have a place where we go into toxic stress, and I think you all probably know when you hit that, like, this is more than I can deal with right now. I don't feel right. I'm not sleeping. I'm not eating. My heart's racing. I think many of us have had that in the last few years. Yep. And then trauma is something that's really outside the bounds of what would normally happen in a person's life. And it exceeds our ability to cope. So that's how I think about it. It's both this event and it exceeds our ability to integrate it emotionally, to cope with it, to function, to go on. So that's how I think of it. And
Yes, and I think it's very important that trauma is held in the body. It's not something you think out of or you can feel your way out of. It's a physical reality. It's a neurological change in your brain. So to understand that our bodies are changing if we experience trauma is very, very important, because often people are being blamed. Why don't you snap out of it? Why don't you think positive? Why doesn't your faith help you out of this? It is not something that you think your way out of, feel your way out of, because it's physical. It's held in your body. That's very important.
And is trauma the right way to talk about the last couple of years?
I think it's one way to talk about it. And it might be even helpful because sometimes I think that word can be overused and everything is trauma, and that in some ways does a disservice to other experiences as we're trying to make sense of it in our lives. And so I've worked with the language of sort of stress, toxic stress, and then when we have actually encountered traumas. And I would say, I'm just speaking for me, in the last 2 years, it's been very stressful. And I've had periods, I would even call it toxic stress, with just more kind of work-related, lots of things going on. But I haven't been traumatized. But I know people who have. People who don't have a choice to go to work or not. They had to go to work. It was at a point where we had no protection, and then they live at home with 4 generations of people, and people died. That's trauma, right? And so I don't want to go through and say I've been traumatized with that. I've been very stressed. And I think there can be some value in working with our language, so.
Yeah. Is it possible for like 2 people to have had very similar experiences, and for one to experience that as trauma and one to not?
Absolutely. I think, I'm a marriage and family therapist, so I'm thinking intergenerationally. The belief is that we are passing unconsciously traumatic stories, traumatic things on from one generation to the other. For example, I'm from Germany. I was born in '65. My mom was a baby born during the war. My father was a teenager during the war. And my grandmother was an adult, having 3 babies during the war. I didn't have trauma growing up because I was born 20 years later after the war ended. But the 3 generations before me, and I count my dad as another generation because he's 13 years older than my mom, they all had different levels of trauma in their bodies. And these were the people who raised me. So even though I grew up happily playing outside in nature and having a good time, the trauma that was held in my family's bodies impacted me. And I didn't know that at the time what it was that was not working well in the adults' way of relating to the world. They were highly anxious, highly reactive, and I didn't understand it until I became a marriage and family therapist to realize that I also hold their trauma in my body. For example, when the pandemic hit, I have twin girls, and my grandmother had to flee with 3 little girls. And in my body, the memory came up, and I made plans to flee this country and go with my children back to Germany. Because it was very irrational. There was COVID in Germany, you know. There was no getting around it. But my body remembered this trauma, even though I never had it. But the story, just knowing the story and knowing the people has transmitted the experience. So somebody else might not have thought about fleeing the country, but the intensity with which I interpreted and experienced, you know, for example, in my body, the pandemic is a war experience, and probably 900,000 people dying in this country in 2 years is maybe the first war experience that a lot of Americans had on this ground, on this soil. I think to think about it like that is very helpful, not to scare people, but to understand that collectively our bodies is holding this trauma. And we're talking about pandemic babies. You know, the babies that are born now, they will experience the trauma of their older siblings and their parents and their grandparents. So just be aware that you're transmitting unconsciously the stress, some of us the trauma, and that we need to learn about it so that we can protect the pandemic babies from the impact that our bodies have taken in during this time.
Will you say more about what it means when you say you hold it in your body?
Yes, there is something called a trauma brain that develops. It's the fight, flight, freeze brain. Sometimes it's even submit and nurture. There can also be trauma reactions. And it's kind of the instinctual brain. And it's getting disconnected when trauma hits. It is getting disconnected from our rational adult brain. That's why sometimes you do such irrational things when you are traumatically activated, because you act differently. And sometimes we see people being very irrational acting when they're in trauma. And that's because this instinctual trauma brain that's in the back of your head has its own life. And that's so important. That gets injured, and that needs to be healed if you want to heal trauma.
And that, if I can follow up on that too, from some of what we know in the medical world that is, and Dorothea has described it beautifully, another way this trauma gets brought through generations is literally through the epigenetic changes in our DNA. So we now have research on this. A lot of the research comes out of the Holocaust survivor communities and other parts of the country with amazing research. So just as you've described, you may have a more ordinary stress, but your reactivity is something really powerful. And so what's happening is this very strong activation of the sympathetic nervous system that we all have. But some of us carry through the generations an exaggeration of that response. And we need to be aware of that and hold that with a lot of compassion, and we can mitigate that. There are ways to do that. That's part of resiliency building. That's part of how I think about the church and health and what makes us stronger and more whole together. So that's, again, some more ways to think about that.
The story I remember from when I was in CPE, which is like my 3 months of what you all spent your entire lives doing, but the one story I remember clearly about this was research done in Israel with families that had been through the Holocaust and the pogroms on eating disorders and the high rate of eating disorders in Israel. And it links back to, if you read to families that had fled pogroms and had had to silence babies and children and eat quickly and eat food prepared quickly and improperly to survive. And that now generations later, families were still eating like that, and they couldn't tell you why, and it seemed normal, and were basically re-traumatizing themselves almost with every meal.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it stuck in my mind. It was such a powerful example of things that many of us carry in our families. Not all of us, I would say, but anyway, I think this is what we're talking about. So this is my segue, is tell us what trauma-informed care is. and why it's important that we develop our knowledge and
Yeah.
skills.
It's really the difference in saying to each other, what is wrong with you versus what has happened to you. And in ourselves, to say, what is wrong with me? Which we all do, right? But instead we say, what has happened to me? What am I experiencing? As we get more knowledgeable about our own bodies, particularly this stress response, what we feel, what we experience, and how that translates into other parts of health, which are very important, we may get to that, then we can meet that with compassionate, intelligent, common sense, community-based supports that actually promote wellness.
Yeah, and I think in our culture there's still a lot of systems that are very shaming when it comes to trauma, or it's a taboo, it's not being talked about. I'm working with soldiers, for example, that don't get care, they shouldn't call it trauma. It is a weakness. It's being seen as only the weak ones have this. So there is a judgment attached to traumatic impact and then non-functioning, because trauma makes you freeze, it makes you flee, it makes you fight, and you cannot stop it. So soldiers that experience this are being shunned, it's taboo, you don't talk about it, they feel a lot of shame, they feel a lot of, sometimes they leave the army in a sense of, something must be wrong with me, instead of it being collectively acknowledged that trauma is real. And that happens in churches as well, when you have persons that have a high reactivity who are maybe going through a traumatic time. Sometimes this well-meaning, just have a little bit more faith in God. If you believed in Jesus, everything would be good. To the point that when I was younger, there was a woman who was deeply depressed and she could not get out of that, and the faith community said, if you just prayed more, if you just did this more, to the point that she committed suicide. She was so desperate because nobody would acknowledge her as being normal and having any knowledge about trauma. So if we're not careful and we are ignorant as a faith community, we participate in this well-meaning shaming and pull yourself up on your bootstraps. And it's a real condition. It's not something that somebody can will their way out. And that's a myth. So we need to learn about trauma, how it manifests in our body, and to understand and to develop compassion. First of all, in therapy, we help people develop self-compassion because we cannot control what the community does. But one person at a time, we can educate and find through education, what? This is trauma? Oh, that makes sense. It's such a relief to find out it's not me, it's my brain, it's my body. So we can, as a community, become trauma-informed, which is right in line with theological compassion and grace.
That's a great segue. Why is it important for churches to be trauma-informed?
Yeah. In my opinion, and certainly in many of our great leaders and thinkers, it's where the church meets the world. We say in Education for Ministry and EFM, many of you here are my EFMers. I'm thinking of Jenny McBride, our amazing Jenny McBride, but theology matters. And whether we know it or not, we often are walking through the world with theological images of God, of trauma, of how we make sense of the world. And a lot of times it's unexamined. And one of the gifts of EFM, spending time immersed in theology and in a church, is we can look at that. For example, what Dorothea was saying, and I see this all day, every day, and I'm sure you do in your work, people have these traumatic events, an illness, a violence, and you have this image that somehow God allows this, God wills this, or maybe because there was a good outcome 20 years later, that was all God's plan. And in my experience, that's one of the most destructive forms of theology out there. I've met more people who leave the church over that one article of theology than anything. And maybe you have different experiences, but that's been mine. And the truth is, when we immerse ourselves in theology, that's not our theology. That's not what Scripture says. It's not our tradition. We have a God that was united with suffering, in solidarity with suffering. And that's where the church meets this issue. And I think as we get better at theology, how do we make sense of that? How do we speak of that in our world, in our ministry, in our evangelism? It makes a big difference, because the church, when done well, can really keep us resilient.
I think one of the struggles with the text, right, is that we see things in the Bible, and because we're taught to read fairy tales, frankly, right? That's how our culture does it. We see it, and we see that God wanted it this way, right? That God approves. When sometimes I think what the Bible is doing is telling us a story that's deeply troubling, and we should be troubled by it, and they would have been troubled by it when they told it, and we read it as God, that as the will of God, and it might, sometimes it says that, like the editors have put that in, but often it's just telling us that I think that the nature of this life is struggle, and we've shifted the theology, I think. You use the word grace. You're a Lutheran, right? Lutherans use the word grace a lot. It's the Lutheran gift, I think, to the larger Christian community. Tell us how this connects to grace for you.
I think the first step, if trauma is a reality, and right now it's a collective reality, it never was. We had some individuals that we tried to care for because they had some trauma. Right now we need to think about it. All of us have trauma. And if sometimes it's secondary trauma, to have a neighbor die, it's not my family member, it's not immediate, but it's secondary because we've lived next door 20 years, so it's secondary trauma. So it is trauma. It hits you, it changes you. So the first step, I think, is radical acceptance. That's the first step towards healing. If we deny that this bothers me or that has changed me, or if we don't allow the pain, the trauma of another family to impact me, I'm in denial, and I'm actually splitting myself further off from my body and further off from the community and further off from my own trauma. So the radical acceptance that trauma is real, that trauma is in all of us, and that we all need healing. That's the first step. And I think the second step, I would call it grace. Acceptance is already grace. If you can accept it, you already experience grace. The second step of grace is radical compassion. That's the second step. Radical self-compassion, because you've probably been raised to will yourself out of this. If you just work hard, you can overcome anything. So these myths, that are not trauma-informed, they're not even resilient. They are just a competitive way of trying to get ahead by discounting your emotions and your body. It is not helping especially in trauma. I mean, if you're healthy, you might keep that up for a few years until your body says, I don't want that anymore. But to become radically accepting, to help people become radically compassionate with themselves and others, that's grace. That is translating the concept of God's grace into our community and into our relationship with ourselves, as we are all communally, collectively traumatized.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one question, and after this question, I know you have your questions. That's the microphone. If you could just stay a little bit distant from each other, if you do line up. So our plan is to have some sessions and groups over the course of the year that you can join, that do this work together, and I hope you'll think about that. And if you know of people for whom it might be useful, everyone's welcome. And so we'll begin to organize that this year. But before we open up for questions, my final question for you is, what does resilience mean or look like? What is that?
Resilience is post-traumatic growth, post-stress growth, is what we all want. The body wants to be well. Communities want to be well. We want to heal. We don't want to stay in illness. So resilience is accessing that part of our body that already wants wellness. And we did some wonderful resiliency classes before you got here, Winnie, and went through this. There's some wonderful science around this. And if there's interest and energy in doing that again, we can revisit that. So resilience is elasticity, growth, all that forward-thinking part of life that we also have, and we've always had. And I think we are going to be integrating that very much at this time, after all of this, in some new and wonderful ways.
Yeah, I think it is translating your faith into real spiritual practice that includes the body and your emotions. It's a holistic way, and it's a lifestyle change. There are certain things that you need to do if your brain is traumatized to heal. It's like rehab. You have to do certain things, and the research is amazing. The last 20 years, the research, you're not just popping a pill. This is not how it works. I mean, yes, symptoms can be reduced. Sometimes you have to, when you're deeply depressed, and you have to, take every help you can get. But beyond sometimes having to take medication for depression or for anxiety, it is really, really important to learn about what heals the brain. And there are wonderful, wonderful ways. But it is like rehab. You have to do it every day. And it can become part of your faith journey, actually. It's a spiritual practice to incorporate your body, your emotions, your brain, and practice the healing of that. And as you do that, you actually can help others to find these resilient practices that can heal brain, body, and if the trauma is very severe, you have to do it lifelong. It's like if you have diabetes, you have to practice lifelong. If you have a major trauma, it's a lifelong lifestyle, but it's also very pleasant. It's not like, it doesn't hurt. Healing trauma is a beautiful, beautiful spiritual practice. So it's not something to think, oh my God, I don't want to. It's really a beautiful way of living if you as a community and as individuals practice trauma resilience and healing.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, please go on. It's up to you. I think you're far enough away, yeah.
Okay. I think there's two things here. We have grief. We have trauma. Yeah. Define and then talk about the interaction between grief and trauma. Did you hear that?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So she asked about the interaction between grief and trauma.
Yeah.
So either,
Dorothea, do you have thoughts on that?
I think they're like cousins. There are aspects sometimes in grief that are traumatic, but grief is so pervasive. There are primary losses, secondary losses, expected losses, unexpected losses. I think the unexpected losses sometimes come closer to the trauma experience or the inbreaking of something that you can't control that makes it more of a trauma. The grief cycle or the walking through the grief is always part of trauma. The emotional body needs to heal by grieving. Grieving is the word I would say for the emotional part of the traumatic recovery. And sometimes grief is not necessarily traumatic, and it heals faster, and it heals better. But if it has a traumatic aspect to it, then I would call it complicated grief. Then it doesn't go away in a certain amount of time by regular grief practices. Then I think you need additional help and support.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm curious about your thoughts about how this huge economic inequality in the world, the climate crisis, racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, et cetera, causes trauma. Because that's my understanding, it's constant, and so we're all somehow on one end of all of those systems of oppression. I'd just love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yes.
I think, Kepi, we name it, first of all, because it actually is and I think of that more of the ongoing chronic trauma. Yeah, the traumatic nature of poverty is one, when we think about the church, that we really all have to be familiar with and aware and really go forward in life with. Poverty is traumatic, and what's happened environmentally now, as we know, affects the poor right now more than anyone, and will continue. So I think that's important to name that as, part of this chronic stress that we hold. And then also sometimes I think of it as, okay, now it's time to move into some resilience growth places too, because if we only stay in these places, it's not good for us. So it's kind of that conversation of managing the day-to-day, sometimes news and stress, and get in touch with our everyday practices that keep us healthy.
Yeah, I think we're entering a new era in some ways. Before, the traumas that would happen in another country or continent would not impact me. But now it does. With the interconnectedness of the media, that we know everything, I think the collective trauma is also a collective chance of resilience and of awakening in some ways. I think globally we're being challenged as a human race to learn all we can about collective trauma, individual trauma, in order to counteract it, in order to be a healing force, in order to be contributors to the shifting out of trauma into another way of living and interbeing, the awareness of how much we are interconnected. It can be devastating, it can be traumatizing, but it can also be that exactly the same force to bring about healing and change. Hi, Tanya.
My question is about, obviously, trauma. And I am the daughter of one of those 900,000 victims of COVID. And it was more traumatic than I ever imagined. I think people don't realize the death of COVID, how just devastating it is to the body and the mind, and also the family members that watch this suffering. So there's resilience. I have resilience now that it's been 10 and a half months since I lost my dad. But the trauma comes up, like even sitting here today, I'm sweating, my heart is racing. I can really feel my heart outside my chest. And it's difficult because you're faced with COVID every single day. Yeah. So there's not one day that I don't wake up and I have to read something or hear something or see someone that thinks it's not real, and it's real. My family was devastated. So I just would like to hear a little bit about, that, in your opinion.
Thank you. Tanya, one way to think about that is an example of your sympathetic stress response, which is what we all have faced. You get a call, my dad's sick. Many of us have had that encounter, and you have this episode of traumatic illness and all the layers of that with COVID. But you're in sympathetic stress mode lots of times, getting activated. You hear something in the culture right now with these incredible divides, and your body is activated. We can also invoke practices, and that is different from talking you out of your activation. It is what it is. But we can also invoke these relaxation practices that invoke the parasympathetic nervous system. So that's the part of our body that calms down, that lets us rest, that lets us recover, regenerate, and doing that intentionally. And so that's the work of some of the mindfulness programs, the yoga programs, all this work in positive psychology, so doing things that you love, people who've got your back, that feeling when somebody has your back. These are all part of resiliency building practices. So it's not either or, it is both and. you have this has happened, you will be triggered, but you can also meet that with some very strategic practices. And that's where I love sometimes to envision faith and history and all these wonderful practices we get to carry with us that have kept our ancestors well. And it's really, for me, quite powerful. So.
There are also some, if there are these moments that you cannot forget, that come back every morning when you wake up, there are some amazing resources, for example, eye movement desensitization, where you help make new neural connections between that part of your brain that got isolated and holds the memory with your adult brain that wants to say, hey, that was 10.5 months ago, but they don't talk to each other. So there are trauma specialists that do eye movement desensitization where new neural connections are being built between that part of your brain that cannot forget, and for that part of your brain it was yesterday, and it's happening again tomorrow. And then the other part says, why am I like this? Why can I not move on? So they're disconnected. So there are amazing research now how to reconnect those parts of your brains, and it doesn't take very long, so it's very promising. But if you have an event especially that you can't forget, that's because those parts of your brain don't communicate. And don't beat yourself up, it's neurological. It's not that you don't have a strong will or that you don't want to grieve or that you don't want to move on, it's real. So,
I think for me it's because you have to face it so often. Like,
the triggering, yeah.
It's like always in front of you. The pandemic is always here.
In some ways, you have to get to know your body in a new way and protect yourself from too much triggering. Sometimes you can't protect yourself, but if you know, also protect each other. Like, when I spill my trauma, just know that there are probably 5 people around you that are also traumatized. Sometimes to give a warning, what I'm sharing right now could be triggering to some of you. That would be a trauma-informed premise before you share your trauma with somebody. That way, the person who might not be able to cope today with being triggered says, I'm coming right back. They're taking a break. They don't need to hear that right now and come back. So that's a form of self-protection, which exactly you're being gentle with your brain.
Thank you, Tanya, for sharing. And I think we have time for one more, and then we've got to head to the service.
Thank you. I'm 65 years old, and I was deeply traumatized with circumcision. And throughout my life, I've never heard that addressed, honestly, in a school setting, in a media setting, and in a church setting. And circumcision in the Israelite church was done on the 8th day. And here in our society, we removed the manhood of infants with a knife on the day they're born. And you spoke about the brain having a trauma memory. And I looked in the Episcopal Church, their resolutions, and the only resolution I ever found on circumcision was in like 95, that we should not allow this as a bring back the Israelite church. So you spoke on theology. Why is it that we don't ever hear this as a theological question? And how is it that we institutionalize our ability to phase that out completely from our conversation? Okay. That fascinates me, is that it's an occult practice, really. And so that's my view, of course, it is a hidden practice. And then I can go on, but I'd like to hear something on that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think what you just did is a sign of creating a trauma-informed community, because you shared your trauma with us, which often traumas are hidden. A lot of traumas are not being talked about. They're taboo. The community is uncomfortable. The community doesn't want to deal with it. But you having the courage to speak about it as trauma enables and empowers us to hold that with you as an awareness. Because, if a community is not aware, the community cannot become trauma resilient, informed, and helping individuals recover.
But that's the question is the community awareness. I mean, that's your whole
It
focus.
starts with the trauma victim to become a trauma survivor, to be strong enough to talk about it. And the moment the trauma survivor, the victimization is ended and survivorhood starts, and the collective community is open to have survivors talk, that's how healing happened for the individual and for the community as well.
Wouldn't a better focus be to let's stop this horrible practice as a teaching for the community, from the church, from the medical, from the psychological point of view? Can we address this somehow? I'm addressing it individually to y'all, but oh my God, it's your profession, that's your job, and I don't see that happening within your profession at all, or within the medical, psychological, religion. I'm just one guy, and I just said something
respectfully,
taboo.
we hear you, and we're going to have to wrap up a little bit.
Thank you.
That's what I was saying. It's like I can't address it.
You need the community to support you.
Yeah.
That's what I'm wondering is where is that?
That's right. I appreciate you saying that.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you all. Thank you. Thank you for being with us. And we
my
will be
pleasure.
learning together throughout the year. There's a lot to learn, and clearly a capacity we need as a community. So some of us are going to go get ready for the service, but the rest of you have got about 15 minutes. So please do have the conversations you need to have, and thank you.
Great.